Beneath the ridge at Senlac Hill on the morning of October 14th, 1066, stood a king who had never lost a battle, a warrior whose name struck fear across the North Sea, a man who, just 19 days earlier, had annihilated an invading Viking army in one of the most decisive victories in English history. Yet by nightfall, he would be dead, his kingdom shattered, and the course of an entire nation permanently altered. All because of a trap so simple in concept, yet so devastating in execution that historians still study it as one of the great tactical deceptions in medieval warfare. And to understand how the deadliest warrior in Britain walked into it, we have to go back to the fragile, uncertain world of 11th century England, a kingdom balanced precariously between competing claims, ambitious earls, and a childless king whose death would ignite one of the most consequential succession crises in European history. Harold Godwinson was not born to be king. He was the son of Godwin, Earl of Wessex, the most powerful nobleman in England, a man whose family had clawed its way to dominance through political cunning, strategic marriages, and sheer force of will. And Harold inherited both his father's ambition and his talent for survival in a court defined by shifting loyalties. By the early 1060s, Harold had become the indispensable right hand of King Edward the Confessor, a pious and politically weak monarch who left much of the actual governance of England to his powerful earls. And among them, Harold stood apart, not merely as a nobleman, but as a proven military commander, having led successful campaigns against Welsh forces in the years prior. Campaigns that demonstrated his skill in using terrain, speed, and coordinated infantry tactics to devastating effect. But it was not only Harold's battlefield record that made him formidable. It was his political intelligence, his ability to read a room of hostile nobles and emerge with alliances intact. And this combination of martial skill and political shrewdness made him, in the eyes of many contemporaries, the most capable warrior and statesman in the kingdom. Yet looming over Harold's rise was a promise made years earlier, a promise that would become the ideological justification for an invasion that would change England forever. Sometime around 1064, Harold traveled to Normandy, and the exact circumstances remain debated among historians, some suggesting he was shipwrecked and fell under the protection of Duke William of Normandy, others proposing he was sent by Edward on a diplomatic mission. But what is generally agreed upon, largely through Norman sources and the Bayeux Tapestry, is that while in Normandy, Harold swore an oath to support William's claim to the English throne, an oath sworn, according to Norman chroniclers, on sacred relics, making its violation not just a political betrayal, but a spiritual one in the eyes of medieval Christian society. Whether Harold made this oath freely or under duress remains one of the most debated questions of the period, and different chroniclers, writing from different national perspectives, offer conflicting interpretations, a reminder that history is often shaped by who survives to write it. When King Edward the Confessor died in January 1066, England faced a succession crisis without a clear heir. Edward was childless, and while there were other claimants with blood ties to the royal line, none possessed the political support, military backing, or practical capability that Harold did. And so the Witnagemote, the Council of English Nobles, elected Harold Godwinson as king, crowning him the very next day in Westminster Abbey, a swift coronation designed to present the kingdom with a fait accompli before rival claimants could organize opposition. This decision immediately created two furious rivals across the sea. In Normandy, Duke William considered Harold's coronation a direct violation of the sacred oath, and he began assembling an invasion fleet, seeking and receiving papal support by framing his cause as a matter of broken faith and justice. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, King Harald Hardrada of Norway, one of the most feared warriors in Europe, a man who had fought as a mercenary in the Byzantine Varangian Guard and built a fearsome reputation across half the known world, also claimed the English throne through a complicated inheritance agreement made decades earlier between previous kings, and he too began preparing an invasion force. Harold Godwinson now faced the extraordinary military nightmare of potentially fighting two separate invasions from two different directions. And this is where the story's tension begins to build, because throughout the summer of 1066, Harold kept his forces stationed along the southern coast, anticipating William's Norman invasion fleet. But as weeks turned into months, and the harvest season approached, Harold was forced to make a difficult logistical decision. Disbanding much of his southern levy because English field forces, essentially part-time citizen soldiers, could not be kept indefinitely away from their farms without risking famine and economic collapse. It was almost as if fate had designed the cruelest possible timing, because no sooner had Harold released his southern forces than word arrived that Harold Hardrada, in alliance with Harold's own estranged brother Tostig, who had been exiled as Earl of Northumbria and sought revenge, had landed a massive invasion fleet in the north of England, capturing York after defeating local forces at the Battle of Fulford. Harold now had to move his army with extraordinary speed, marching roughly 185 miles from London to Yorkshire in just 4 days, an astonishing feat of medieval logistics and endurance that speaks to both Harold's leadership and the discipline of his housecarls, the elite professional warriors who formed the core of his standing army. On September 25, 1066, Harold's forces caught Harold Hardrada's army by surprise at Stamford Bridge, and in a battle that showcased Harold's tactical brilliance, the English forces inflicted a catastrophic defeat on the Norwegian invaders, killing both Harold Hardrada and Tostig, and effectively ending Norway's centuries-long ambitions over English territory in a single decisive engagement. A victory so complete that of the reported 300 ships that had carried the invading force, only a small fraction were needed to carry the survivors home. This triumph should have secured Harold's reign, should have proven definitively that he was, without exaggeration, the deadliest and most capable warrior in Britain, a king who had defeated one of Europe's most feared military legends in open battle. But fate allowed him almost no time to savor this victory or rest his exhausted army, because just 3 days later, on September 28th, William's Norman invasion fleet finally landed at Pevensey on the southern coast. Having been delayed for weeks by unfavorable winds, and now Harold faced an agonizing decision, whether to rest his battle-worn troops or race south immediately to confront a second massive invasion force. Harold chose speed once again, marching his army back toward London and then on toward the coast, gathering what reinforcements he could along the way. But this second forced march, following so closely after the brutal engagement at Stamford Bridge, meant his forces arrived in the south exhausted, under strength, and without the full complement of English shire levies who simply had not had time to muster and join him. A logistical reality that many historians argue significantly weakened his position before the battle even began. On the night of October 13th, Harold positioned his army along a ridge near Hastings, a location later known as Senlac Hill, choosing terrain that offered clear tactical advantages, a narrow approach that would limit the effectiveness of William's cavalry and force the Norman forces into a difficult uphill assault. And this was, in many ways, exactly the kind of ground on which Anglo-Saxon shield wall tactics were designed to dominate. The English army formed the shield wall, a formation that had proven devastatingly effective for generations, with housecarls in the front ranks wielding massive two-handed Danish axes capable of cutting through armor and shield alike, supported by the less heavily armored field forces behind them. And this wall of interlocked shields and disciplined spearmen created a nearly impenetrable defensive barrier, one that had never been broken by direct frontal assault in living memory. When the battle began on the morning of October 14th, William's forces launched repeated attacks up the slope, first with archers whose arrows largely failed to penetrate the shield wall due to the upward angle of fire, then with infantry, and then with cavalry charges, and time after time, the English line held, the discipline of Harold's housecarls proving just as formidable on this southern battlefield as it had been against the Norwegians weeks earlier. For hours, the battle hung in the balance, and by many contemporary accounts, William's forces began to falter, with rumors even spreading through the Norman ranks at one point that the Duke himself had been killed, forcing William to remove his helmet and ride along the lines to prove he was still alive and rally his wavering troops, a moment that reveals just how close this battle came to ending in a complete Norman collapse. But it was in this critical, uncertain phase of the battle that the trap began to take shape, whether by deliberate Norman strategy or by circumstance that Norman commanders then exploited. Because sections of William's cavalry, after a failed charge, began retreating down the hill, and portions of the English line, sensing victory, broke formation to pursue the fleeing Norman soldiers. This is one of the most debated tactical moments in medieval military history, because historians disagree on whether these retreats were genuinely a panicked collapse that William's commanders then cleverly exploited by turning to counterattack the pursuing English, or whether it was a calculated, feigned retreat used deliberately as a tactic, a maneuver known from earlier continental warfare, designed specifically to lure disciplined defenders out of the safety of their formation. What we do know with reasonable historical confidence is that this pattern repeated more than once during the battle, and each time, portions of Harold's shield wall broke ranks to chase the retreating Normans, only for William's cavalry to wheel around and cut down the now isolated and exposed English soldiers in the open field, where their armor and infantry tactics offered none of the protection the shield wall had provided. This was the trap that Britain's deadliest warrior, a man who had outmarched and outfought one of history's most feared Viking commanders just weeks earlier, could not fully prevent, because a shield wall's greatest strength, its unbroken cohesion, was also its greatest vulnerability, entirely dependent on the discipline of every single soldier holding position, and in the heat and chaos of battle, with the scent of apparent victory in the air. Discipline is agonizingly difficult to maintain across an entire army of thousands, particularly one that included less experienced field levies alongside professional housecarls. Each time the English line thinned through these localized pursuits, William's forces gained ground, gradually eroding the once impenetrable wall, and as the day wore into afternoon, the sheer exhaustion of Harold's army, still recovering from the forced marches and the brutal fight at Stamford Bridge less than 3 weeks prior, began to compound the tactical damage caused by the broken formations. Then, in the battle's final and most consequential phase, Harold Godwinson himself was killed, though the exact circumstances of his death remain one of history's genuinely contested questions, with the Bayeux Tapestry, our most famous visual source from the period, showing a figure struck in the eye by an arrow near an inscription reading Harold, while other near-contemporary accounts describe him being cut down by a group of Norman knights, and modern historians remain divided on which account. If either fully represents what actually happened, a reminder that even significant historical events can carry genuine ambiguity that responsible storytelling must acknowledge rather than resolve with false certainty. What is clear is that Harold's death marked the collapse of organized English resistance at Hastings, because in Anglo-Saxon warfare, the king or the lord was often the symbolic and literal center of the army's cohesion, and once word spread that Harold had fallen, the will to continue the fight evaporated among the remaining defenders, leading to the final rout as William's forces overran what remained of the English position as darkness approached. The Battle of Hastings, decided in a single brutal day, stands as one of the most consequential military engagements in European history, not simply because it determined who would sit on the English throne, but because of the sweeping transformation it triggered across every level of English society in the decades that followed. William, now known to history as William the Conqueror, did not immediately secure total control of England after Hastings. It took several more years of campaigning, including brutal suppression of northern rebellions, before Norman authority was fully consolidated, but the trajectory set in motion on that October day was irreversible. The Norman conquest fundamentally restructured English landholding, replacing much of the existing Anglo-Saxon nobility with Norman lords loyal to William. A redistribution of power and property so thorough that it was later documented in extraordinary bureaucratic detail through the Domesday Book, commissioned in 1086, which remains one of the most remarkable administrative surveys of the medieval world. Beyond the political and economic upheaval, the conquest triggered a linguistic transformation whose effects are still audible in English today. As Norman French, spoken by the new ruling class, blended over centuries with Old English, producing thousands of loanwords and reshaping the vocabulary of law, governance, cuisine, and social class in ways that permanently altered the English language. Castles, largely unfamiliar as a widespread architectural and military feature in Anglo-Saxon England, spread rapidly across the landscape under Norman rule, serving both as military strongpoints and as visible symbols of the new order's dominance over the conquered population. The feudal structures introduced and expanded under Norman governance reshaped English social and legal systems for centuries, embedding a hierarchy of land tenure and obligation that would influence English institutions well into the later medieval period. And yet, for all this transformation, it is worth pausing to consider what made Harold Godwinson's defeat so historically striking in the first place. Because this was not a battle lost through incompetence or cowardice, but one lost by a genuinely skilled commander, undone by a combination of exhausting circumstance, a razor-thin margin of tactical error, and an enemy who recognized and ruthlessly exploited a single moment of battlefield discipline breaking down. Harold's victory at Stamford Bridge remains, on its own merits, one of the most impressive feats of medieval military logistics and combat leadership in English history, a reminder that his reputation as a formidable warrior was not exaggerated propaganda, but a demonstrated reality on the battlefield just weeks before his death. The tragedy of Hastings lies precisely in this contrast, that a commander capable of such a decisive and overwhelming victory in the north could be undone in the south not through lack of skill, but through a trap that exploited the fundamental tension in medieval infantry warfare between disciplined defensive cohesion and the very human temptation to chase a fleeing enemy when victory seems within reach. It raises a question that echoes far beyond the 11th century and speaks to something universal about warfare and leadership across history, because so many pivotal battles throughout military history have turned not on raw strength or superior numbers, but on the discipline to hold formation when instinct screams to pursue, and on the ability of a commanding force to sense and exploit exactly that moment of human weakness in an opponent otherwise fighting with skill and courage. Harold Godwinson's death at Hastings did not end because Britain's deadliest warrior lacked the ability to win. It happened because even the most capable commanders operate within the limits of exhausted men, imperfect formations, and the unpredictable psychology of thousands of soldiers making split-second decisions under the chaos and terror of close combat. And understanding this helps us see the Battle of Hastings not simply as a story of Norman triumph, but as a profound lesson in how even the most decisive military reputations can be undone by a single, carefully exploited moment of vulnerability, a lesson that continues to resonate wherever discipline, deception, and the fog of battle intersect on history's most consequential fields.